The air in the briefing room tasted like burnt coffee and bad intentions. Under the flickering hum of the fluorescent lights, Master Sergeant Sarah Sterling sat perfectly still. At 42, her face was a map of cold sun and high-altitude wind, her eyes the color of winter ice. Across the table, Major Jackson Thorne leaned back in his chair, his uniform crisp and devoid of a single dust mote. He tapped a touchscreen tablet, his lip curling as his gaze drifted to the heavy, bolt-action rifle leaning against Sarah's chair. "You're telling me you want to carry that museum piece into a high-threat zone?" he asked, the laughter barely contained behind his teeth. He glanced at the younger operators of Team Alpha, who adjusted their digital HUD interfaces and shared quiet smirks. "Technology has evolved since the 90s, Sergeant. Frankly, so has the Army," he added, his voice dripping with the kind of pity that wanted to be seen. Sarah didn't blink. Her hands rested flat on the table, absorbing the faint vibration of a distant generator through the laminate surface. She didn't need to explain that batteries die, sensors glitch, and drones can be jammed by the very man they were hunting. She simply watched him, her silence a slow pressure that swallowed the Major's arrogance 1 second at a time. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Jackson Thorne wasn't just arrogant, he was already compromised. Inspired by the spirit of those who serve in silence. Sarah Sterling lived in a world defined by the physics of silence. Back in Montana, her mornings were governed by the direction of the wind through the ponderosa pines. She would sit on her porch with a tin mug of black coffee, watching the mist roll off the Bitterroot Mountains, reading the sky the way most people read a newspaper. To the locals, she was just the quiet woman who worked at the hardware store and never spoke of the past. They didn't see the way she scanned the ridgeline every morning for shapes that didn't belong. They didn't notice the way her eyes tracked a hawk in flight, calculating its drift and airspeed out of pure, reflexive habit. But inside her cabin, tucked in a cedar chest near the back wall, lay the remnants of a different life entirely. There were medals earned in shadows, a frayed photograph of a younger Sarah standing in the dust of a distant desert, and a small notebook with battered covers that held more classified math than most field manuals. When the recall order came, she hadn't been surprised. She had been standing at the kitchen sink watching a pair of ravens work the tree line, and she had known, the way you know, a storm before the barometer moves. Now, standing in the sterile hallway of the facility in Stuttgart, she felt the familiar, unwelcome weight of her own history settle back onto her shoulders. As she reached for her gear bag, a subtle tremor moved through her right hand. She tightened her grip before anyone could see it. It wasn't a tremor of fear. It was the physical echo of 1,000 cold nights spent behind a trigger, the cumulative cost of all those held breaths and steady heartbeats. Her mind drifted back to the highway of death, a memory that smelled of burning rubber and scorched sand. She had been 22 then, a prodigy with a long-range rifle and a heart that hadn't yet turned to stone. In that desert, she had learned that a bullet doesn't just travel through space. It travels through time, through lives, through the quiet moments people leave behind when they are gone. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the metallic clack of her bolt cycling in the dark. She had been a ghost then, a shadow moving through the dunes, invisible to the men she was sent to stop. The Army had forged her into a tool of absolute precision. But tools wear down at the edges, and 20 years is a long time to be sharp. Now, she felt the phantom itch of the sand in her boots and the dry burn of the cobble sun on the back of her neck. The younger soldiers around her talked about kinetic solutions and integrated battle networks like men describing a video game. They saw the battlefield as a digital grid, icons and data points managed from behind a screen. Sarah saw it as a living thing, something breathing and patient and entirely capable of swallowing a person whole. She knew that when the power failed and the satellites went dark, the only thing left was the discipline inside your chest. She wondered if she still had the strength to find that stillness after so long in the pines. The Major's voice echoed in her head. Relic, outdated, past her prime. Maybe he was right, she thought, her eyes tracing the grain of the floorboards. But as she felt the familiar tension gather in her shoulders, The crow began to stir, cold and patient and hungry. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt the smooth surface of a spent casing she had carried for 20 years. A reminder of the first time she was forced to choose between a life and a mission. That choice had never gotten easier. It had only become more familiar, like an old injury that aches when the rain moves in. She adjusted her posture, pulled her spine straight, and felt the old muscle memory lock her into place. The tremor in her hand went quiet. She wasn't just a veteran or a retiree called back to fill a slot. She was a predator who had just been invited back into the hunt. And the crow never missed. The ramp of the transport dropped into the freezing air of the Carpathian Mountains, like a door swung open on another century. A jagged landscape of iron-gray rock and suffocating pine forest spread out before them, the kind of terrain that swallows armies. Team Alpha moved off the ramp with aggressive, frantic energy, checking laser designators and cycling night vision goggles as if the gear itself would keep them alive. Staff Sergeant Elias Vance, 10 years younger and built like a truck, shoved past Sarah on the ramp. "Keep up, Grandma," he muttered, his voice muffled by his tactical scarf. "This isn't a nature walk." The team set a punishing pace, boots crunching through frozen crust, their chatter clipped and full of the casual confidence of men who had never had their electronics fail at altitude. Sarah followed in silence, her rucksack heavy, every step sending a dull ache through her knees. She moved with a low, energy-saving gait that the younger men mistook for weakness. To them, she looked like a liability, a dragging anchor on a high-speed insertion. Major Thorne was right. A voice crackled over the short-range radio. "She doesn't belong here." Sarah ignored it. Her eyes were fixed on the ridgeline above, watching the way the shadows pooled in the ravines, reading the mountain the way she had read every terrain she'd ever worked. The team stopped at a rocky outcrop to review the holographic map projected from Vance's wrist unit. The image flickered, sputtered, and died. "Satlink is spotty," Vance growled, shaking his arm. "Temperature inversion will kill your thermals in the valley mist," Sarah said quietly, stepping forward. She pointed toward a cluster of rocks 300 yards below their intended ambush position. "If you set up on the valley floor, your optics will bloom. You'll be shooting at phantoms while he drives right past you." Vance looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been told the sun rises in the west. "We have the latest thermal sensors in the Army arsenal, Sterling. We don't need a weather report from the old dog." He turned back to his team, dismissing her with a flick of his hand. "Stay to the rear. Try not to trip over your rifle while we work." What he didn't say, what none of them said out loud, was that they had been briefed before departure that Sarah Sterling was a political inclusion, a name added to the manifest by a bureaucrat in Washington to satisfy a diversity audit. They believed it because Thorne had told them, and Thorne had reasons of his own for wanting the crow kept far from the front. As the team pushed deeper into the pines, one of the younger operators, a kid named Miller, hit a patch of black ice and went sideways toward a ravine. Sarah's hand shot out before anyone else had processed the movement, her grip closing on the strap of his pack with the strength of someone who had spent years hauling dead weight through worse terrain than this. She pulled him back to solid ground in one clean motion. Miller looked at her, eyes wide behind his goggles, and said nothing. "Watch your center of gravity," she said, her voice quiet and without judgment. "The mountain doesn't care about your rank." Vance glanced back, clocked it, and moved on without a word. They treated her like furniture, visible, functional, and entirely irrelevant to the mission. But furniture doesn't read the wind, and the wind in this valley was beginning to say things the sensors would never hear. As the sun dropped below the jagged peaks and the temperature turned the air into a razor, the team's battery-powered heaters began to fail one by one. Sarah didn't have a heater. She had a wool layer, a knowledge of dead air space, and the patience of a woman who had spent entire winters in hides colder than this. She sat in the shadows and watched them fight their flickering screens, their faith in the machines eroding with every dead battery. The general was out there, moving through the dark, And somewhere above them, invisible and patient, so was something else. The mist settled into the valley like a slow exhale. Team Alpha deployed a surveillance drone, its rotors humming the confident song of modern technology. "Area is clear," Vance whispered, watching the green feed on his wrist monitor. Sarah wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at a cluster of juniper bushes 50 yards to their western flank. The birds had gone silent in that specific quadrant, not gradually, the way birds quiet down at dusk, but all at once, like a switch drone. She knelt and brushed her fingers across a patch of disturbed pine needles near the base of a rock. The soil underneath was dark and damp, the underside exposed to freezing air. Something heavy had pivoted here, and recently. She traced the line of sight from that spot toward a dense thicket of spruce on the opposite ridge. A single branch of hemlock was bent against the prevailing wind, a tiny fracture in the grain of the wood, the kind that happens when a man settles his weight and then breathes. Sarah didn't report it over the radio. She knew what would happen. "Deer," they'd say. "Falling limb. Grandma seeing ghosts." Instead, she quietly pulled her drag bag close and unscrewed the protective caps from her optics. Her eyes moved with the slow, deliberate sweep of a woman who had spent decades learning how a man hides himself in the natural world. She found it, not a glint of glass, but the subtle absence of light where light should have been. A flash kill mesh. A specialized honeycomb screen used by trained snipers to eliminate lens reflection entirely. No heat signature. No electronic pulse. Nothing the drone would ever see. It was a ghost in the machine, and it was looking directly at them. Sarah felt the cold prickle move up the back of her neck, the ancient instinct that every long-range shooter develops or dies without. She adjusted her elevation dial by 2 clicks, her thumb moving with the muscle memory of 20 years of cold mornings. She knew the distance without the rangefinder. She had always known the distance. The drone hummed its clean, confident lie. The team laughed quietly about something from back at base. And in the spruce thicket across the gorge, a professional killer settled his cheek against a stock and exhaled. The crow exhaled too. The difference was that one of them had already been found. The first round came in without warning. It clipped Miller's radio antenna and sent him spinning hard into the dirt, the force of the near miss audible even over the wind. "Sniper, down. Down." Vance's voice cracked across the rocks, stripped of every trace of the earlier bravado. The team scrambled behind a shelf of granite, rifles raised, thermal optics already blooming white in the freezing mist. "I can't get a read." "My sight is washed out," an operator yelled, slamming his palm against his helmet as if that would fix the circuits. Another round cracked into the granite 6 inches from Vance's head, sending chips of stone across his face. "Drones are grounded." "Wind is too high," he called into his comms, his voice flat with the controlled panic of a man trying not to lose it entirely. Sarah dropped prone without a word, becoming part of the frozen earth. She didn't raise her scope yet. She closed her eyes for 3 full seconds and listened to the cadence of the enemy's fire, to the gap between shots, to the direction the report was arriving from relative to the wind. The shooter was good. He was using the mountain to mask his sound signature, timing his shots to the gusts. He was positioned exactly where Sarah had identified the mesh, firing through a natural V-gap in the spruce branches. She pulled the battered notebook from her chest pocket and opened it to a blank page. The pencil moved quickly. Slope angle, temperature drop, estimated wind vector across the gorge, the mil-dot measurement of the spruce tree heights to confirm range. 720 yards. 3 layers of branch canopy between her muzzle and the target. A right-to-left crosswind moving at approximately 12 miles per hour in the gap. "Sterling, what are you doing?" "Get your head down," Vance hissed, staring at her with the look of a man watching someone do something suicidal. She ignored him. Her thumb found the elevation turret of her .338 Lapua and dialed up for the distance, then added 2 clicks of left windage. She wasn't looking for the man. She was looking for the tiny corridor in the foliage where the air moved differently than the needles around it. The thread of open space a 250-grain bullet could navigate if given the right angle of entry. She found it. She settled her cheek against the stock, her right hand finding the grip, and she breathed out until her lungs were almost empty. Her heart rate dropped without effort, the way it always did in the final moment, not because she was calm, but because something older and quieter than calm took over. The trigger reached its wall. She didn't pull it. She let the shot happen the way a pendulum reaches the bottom of its swing. The rifle roared. The recoil drove hard into her shoulder, and the world went white with the muzzle blast for half a second. Then silence. Then a dark shape tumbled out of the spruce thicket and crashed through the frozen branches to the forest floor. The counter-sniper's fire stopped, as if the sound itself had been cut from the air. Vance stared through his binoculars, his mouth open, nothing coming out. "You hit him," he finally said, "through all that brush." Without a sensor. "It wasn't luck," Sarah said, cycling the bolt with a clean, final motion. "It was physics." She caught the ejected brass in her palm and dropped it into her pocket. Sarah was already moving toward the fallen counter-sniper before Vance had fully lowered his binoculars. She reached the body in under 2 minutes, moving through the brush the way only someone who had lived in this kind of terrain could move, low, quiet, leaving nothing disturbed. She wasn't looking for a weapon or a patch of identification. She was looking for what she had suspected since the briefing room in Stuttgart. She found it in an interior chest pocket, wrapped in a strip of rubber to silence it against the body armor. A burner phone. Civilian grade. Prepaid. The kind that cannot be traced through military channels. She powered it on with cold fingers and opened the last sent message. The coordinates were their insertion point. The exact grid reference that only 4 people in the world had known before boots hit the mountain. 3 of them were standing behind her, breathing hard in the freezing air. The 4th was sitting in a climate-controlled office in Stuttgart. Sarah turned and held the screen up so Vance could read it. He read it twice. His jaw moved, but nothing came out. The reason she had been added to this team wasn't a diversity audit. It was a death sentence. Thorne had expected this ambush to do what it had just failed to do, in a place where no one would ask too many questions about the woman who hadn't come home. He had needed the crow eliminated before she got close enough to the general to matter, and he had needed it to look like the mountain's fault. Vance's face moved through 3 separate expressions before it settled into something cold and load-bearing. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I suspected in Stuttgart," Sarah said, pocketing the phone as evidence. "The ambush position Thorne recommended put us directly in the kill zone. The sat-link dropout was timed too well. And no one outside this team knew our insertion window." She looked at him evenly. "I didn't say anything because you wouldn't have listened. Vance had nothing for that, because she was right, and he knew it." "We finished the mission," Sarah said. "Then we hand him the phone." The team didn't argue. One by one, the arrogance left their faces. What replaced it was something more useful. The team breached a subterranean bunker on the valley's eastern edge just before first light. They pulled a high-ranking intelligence officer from the shadows, hands zip-tied, face bloodied, eyes still carrying the defiant shine of a man who believed he had information worth trading. Vance shoved him against the damp concrete wall and demanded coordinates for the general's extraction point. The prisoner spat at Vance's boots and said nothing. Sarah stepped forward from the edge of the room, her rifle slung low, her movements as quiet as smoke and still air. As she reached into her tactical vest for a map, her jacket shifted, and the old, faded patch stitched into the inner lining caught the light. A black bird, clutching a long projectile in its talons. The prisoner's eyes locked onto the embroidery and stayed there. The defiance left his face like a light being switched off. His skin went the color of cold ash, his breathing stuttering in the way that only happens when a person recognizes something they were not prepared to see. "The crow," he whispered, the word barely forming in his throat. He was not looking at a soldier. He was looking at the person who had ended the Butcher of Kabul from 1,300 yards in a sandstorm, a shot that the intelligence community had spent 2 years trying to attribute to anyone other than a lone woman in a forward hide. "You didn't bring a squad," the asset said, his voice dropping to something barely above a breath. "You brought the end." The bunker went absolutely still. Vance and the operators, who had spent 3 days dismissing the woman in their rear, stood with their weapons slightly lowered and their mouths slightly open. The campfire stories were real. The legend that Thorne had tried to bury under bureaucratic contempt was standing 4 feet away from them, her expression as readable as a closed vault door. Sarah leaned in close to the prisoner, close enough that only he could hear what she said next. "Tell me where he is." The man didn't hesitate for a single second. The coordinates came out in a rush, like water through a break in a dam. Respect is a quiet thing when it finally arrives. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles over a room and changes the temperature of the air. The valley filled with the roar of a helicopter fighting the altitude. General Volkov's silhouette was visible through the reinforced glass of the cockpit as the aircraft climbed from a hidden pad cut into the pine forest below. Team Alpha was pinned down 280 yards short of the landing zone by a rearguard heavy machine gun, tracer fire stitching a continuous line across the rocks. "We can't reach the pad." Vance called into the radio, his voice tight. "Requesting close air support." "Negative, Alpha. Air assets are 12 minutes out." "You are on your own." Sarah was already moving. Not toward the firefight. Away from it, climbing a narrow ledge of black shale that switchbacked up the face of the gorge wall. Her knees protested every meter of the ascent, the old aches finding new ways to remind her that 42 is not 22. She climbed anyway, because the math was already working in her head. She found her position in a natural notch of limestone near the top of the gorge wall, a jagged shelf that gave her a direct, unobstructed sightline across the canyon. She ranged the helicopter in her reticle. 1,140 yards. Moving target. Climbing. A right-to-left crosswind running hard through the gorge. She could see it in the way the pine tops were bending on the opposite face. Not a snapshot. A calculated one, with a moving window of about 4 seconds before the aircraft gained enough airspeed to vanish into the cloud base. She settled into the stock, the cold mountain pressing against every inch of her body. She looked at her right hand, the hand that had trembled in the hallway in Stuttgart. The hand that had carried 20 years of cold mornings, held breaths, and lives, changed by single moments. It was perfectly still. Not because the tremors were gone, but because everything in her body understood that this was the moment those 20 years had been pointed at. She dialed her elevation, added aggressive windage for the gorge current, and built the lead calculation for the rotor disc. She wasn't aiming at the aircraft. She was aiming at where the aircraft was going to be. One breath in, one slow breath out, longer than the one before it. In the hollow between heartbeats, the 1-second window where the body is perfectly suspended between its own rhythms, she broke the shot. The .338 Lapua left the muzzle at over 2,900 feet per second and traveled the length of the gorge in just over a second. It punched through the tail rotor assembly at the base of the drive shaft. Not an explosion, just a catastrophic mechanical failure. The rotor stopped. The torque from the main rotor immediately began spinning the airframe, and the helicopter lost its grip on the sky. It descended hard into the dark ravine, the impact a deep metallic crump absorbed by the pines. The machine gun below went silent. The rear guard understood what it meant before the smoke began to rise. On the ledge, Sarah Sterling cycled the bolt. The brass casing clinked off the limestone and dropped into the dark below. She didn't stand up immediately. She stayed prone for a moment, her cheeks still on the stock, her breathing returning to something like normal. Down below, on the rocks, Vance and Team Alpha stood with their weapons lowered, looking up at the ledge. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. They just looked. That silence was the only metal Sarah had ever cared about. 2 days later, in a secured room in Stuttgart, Major Jackson Thorne sat across a table from two men in civilian clothes. He had no lawyer. He had no explanation that held up against a prepaid burner phone, a dead counter-sniper's chest pocket, and the testimony of every surviving member of Team Alpha. The man who had mocked a bolt-action rifle and called a living legend a relic had been feeding General Volkov's security detail American positions for 11 months. He'd expected the Carpathian ambush to close the loop on the one person who could read the mountain well enough to survive it. He was wrong, because Thorne had made the same mistake everyone made. He had looked at the tremor in Sarah Sterling's hand and seen weakness. He hadn't understood that the tremor was a record, 20 years of held breath, carried in the tendons of a woman who had never once missed when it mattered. Sarah wasn't in Stuttgart for the debrief. She was already back in Montana, standing on her porch, wool blanket over her shoulders, tin mug in hand, watching the first snowfall of winter settle over the Bitterroots. Major Thorne had met her on the tarmac before she left, his posture stripped of its earlier confidence, a Silver Star citation clipped to a mahogany folder. He had started a speech about unprecedented precision. She had walked past him without breaking stride. "Give it to Miller," she said over her shoulder. "He's the one who asked to stay." Now, back in the pines, she looked at her right hand. The tremor returned, faint and familiar, like an old friend who only visits in the quiet. She didn't hide it this time. She just let it be what it was. The cost of the work, written into her body the way all real things are written. Being a sniper isn't about the moment of the shot. It is about every silent hour that comes before it, and every heavy morning that comes after. She thought about Team Alpha, young men who would go home to their families because a woman they had called Grandma had watched their backs in the dark. They would tell stories about the Crow, turn her into something mythic and impossible, the way soldiers always do with things they don't fully understand. But Sarah didn't want to be a myth. She just wanted to hear the wind without calculating its drift. She took a long sip of coffee, watched the ravens work the tree line, and let the mountain be quiet around her. The world sleeps because somewhere, in the cold and the dark, there is a person willing to stop breathing at exactly the right moment. They don't ask for parades. They don't leave their names in the headlines. They just go back to the mountains, and they listen, and they wait. Sometimes the quietest soldiers carry the loudest legacies. The mountains keep their secrets. But the legends of the Army's greatest shadows live on in the people who served alongside them, and in the quiet civilians who recognize something true when they hear it. Sarah Sterling's story is a reminder that when technology fails, when the satellites go dark, and when the men in clean uniforms turn out to be the real threat, there is still one thing that cannot be jammed, hacked, or compromised: discipline, patience, and 20 years of cold mornings behind a rifle. If this story hit the way it was meant to, please subscribe for more hidden sniper stories. Your support keeps the legacy of the quiet professionals alive for the people who deserve to hear it. Like this video, share it with a veteran who understands what it costs to hold that breath and what it means to finally let it go. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your powder dry.